Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. We're recording this one on Friday, June 20th, and tomorrow is National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. So, a conversation relevant to that and essential in this political moment. Our guest is National Chief Chief Woodhouse Nepinak of the Assembly of First Nations. Born and raised in the Pinaymootang First Nation of Manitoba. Did I get that right?
Oh, you're so wonderful, Dave. Wow, you got it. You're true to Shabby. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. National Chief Woodhouse began her term in December 23rd, making her the youngest woman and mother to hold the position. Among a very long list of accomplishments, she was the lead negotiator for the First Nations Child and Family Services and Jordan's principal class action lawsuit, resulting in over $40 billion of compensation for First Nations children and families, and we'll get to that at some point in the conversation. Chief Woodhouse has lobbied Senate, the House, cabinet ministers, and the Prime Minister's office to fulfill mandates from chiefs, and she continues to advocate to protect collective rights, treaty inherent rights, title and jurisdiction, the right to self-determination, and all human rights. So today, we're going to talk about the full panoply of the Indigenous agenda in Canada. We're definitely going to dig into Prime Minister Carney's ambitious build agenda and what the AFN feels about that. And how we can get these projects done in a way that First Nations communities feel part of and positive about. And we want to talk about where the reconciliation agenda fundamentally goes from here. Chief Woodhouse, by the way, is the third national chief of the AFN to appear on this podcast, which I'm very proud of. We had Phil Fontaine when he was no longer chief, but had been chief. So thank you for joining us on the show. And you and I know each other.
Yeah.
You and I worked on a political campaign together many, many years ago. How'd you get involved with Paul Martin?
Look, I was a young woman coming off of the First Nation community. I knew nothing about politics. I was a chief's daughter. And, at that point, I think there was lots of women going missing off the streets of Winnipeg.
Yeah.
And my dad had, of course, he was a leader in our community, and I was coming to university in the University of Winnipeg. And Dad had said, look, I know that there's some young, nice boys you can meet. And I want you to meet them. And, and I want you to go to this event, young, and I didn't know then, but it was Young Liberals. Mm. And so I met a boy named Richard Diamond.
Yeah.
He was the old president of, he ended up becoming the president of the Young Liberals of Canada. So he was a friend of mine, and we got
his brother's a terrible conservative.
Yeah, he ran Doug Ford's late brother's campaign. Yeah. So I know that he ran the Stop the Gravy Train in Toronto, and so Michael Diamond is the brother. So I mean, I'd sat with Richard and Michael Diamond and their mom and dad. Their late mom, Robin, was a judge here in Winnipeg. And they were just nice to me. Like, I'd come off of the community, and I never met Jewish people before, but that was the first Jewish family that I met, was the Diamond family. And they were very diverse. Their mom was a judge, stayed out of the politics of her boys, one conservative and one liberal. And it was fascinating to see this. And then their dad kind of was just dad there, right? And they were always nice. They always fed me. I'd stay at their house for the weekends. And I also met another gentleman named Ben Carr, who's now a member of Parliament in Winnipeg. I'm so proud of him. Yeah. But meeting these young people, and then, but how I'd met them is my dad dropped me off at the Fairmont Hotel Winnipeg and said, "You're going to go and meet all these young people." And I said, "Okay." And I think it's because he wanted me to, and to try and learn something, be different, and maybe different from coming from a rural and First Nation community. So I walked in, and there was no First Nations people in the room, like zero. Oh, there was one actually, Elijah Harper.
Oh yeah.
And I was kind of a fan of him, so I'm fangirling him around. And then I met another man named John Manley, I believe was the name at the time. I didn't know much about politics, but I know he was running for, I guess, to be leader and essentially become the prime minister. But I didn't connect with him. I didn't like him very much for whatever reason. I was a young person. I don't know, one way or another. But I bumped into this man named Paul Martin. And what a remarkable person he was. Just charismatic, just full of love, God's love. And him and I just hit it off. And he said to me, I want to be prime minister. And I said, okay, then, well, I'll help you. So I met another person named Reg Alcock and all these wonderful ladies, Robin Lamoureux. He had a whole network of women around
great team
Winnipeg.
in Manitoba.
Oh, yeah. And I remember Sharon Carstairs going to her house, like meeting just all these old senators, all these people. And I didn't know much about politics, but I knew that we needed a different way in this country. And so Paul Martin, he asked me to help him organize. So, he had, asked me to sign up a bunch of members. So I went to the communities and I signed up like thousands of First Nations members. I was like, let's just get involved, right? Like, let's have a voice in this country for once. And so he ended up becoming prime minister. And I remember realizing the power of politics. I was a student at the time, and we, and coming off the community, it's not like your parents have wealth or have homes that are paid off when you're coming off a First Nation community. And so I remember we'd have this little stipend, which was like $600 a month that I would get that would help me to try and go to school. But it was my big help that helped me get to university. And the CRA was trying to tax that. And so I remember and that's a treaty right in my eyes. Like, we promised we'd share all these lands, but let's work on together on education system and the treaty right to education. And I was very big on that at that time. And I remember being in the prime minister's house for dinner at 24 Sussex. And I said to him, CRA is trying to tax us. And I was like, and there's all these, maybe 7,000 students across the country. We don't even have boots to pull up. Give us a break here and let us help ourselves get educated in this country. Very few people have education degrees. There's more coming now. And I'm so proud of First Nations. We have lawyers now and doctors. At that point, very few still. And he said, who's bothering you guys? I'm like, the CRA. And so he made a call. And I remember a few days later in the press, it's like, CRA is going to leave First Nation students alone and let them go to university and not bother them on their their $500, right? They're $600. And I realized then, I'm like, wow, I have a voice. I didn't realize that, right? And then he would just, and then Mr. Martin, made sure that, he says, I think you need to learn about technology in government. And so he sent me I remember going to Budapest for a month, and just a really good experience with him. And I thank him for that, because I think had I not had that mentorship from other Canadians, and there was the first time I met atheists, for instance, coming off my First Nation, was amazing just to meet this diversity of Canadians. And I knew that I was, because my mom is, my dad's, of course, was a chief there at home. And then mom, I knew that, trying to walk in two worlds coming off of a First Nation community is not always an easy thing to do. But I'm so glad that I was able to make good friends, because I can see then why my dad wanted me to make different friends than, ending up who knows where, right? I think you can be pulled any which way when you come to a big city and you're 18 years old. And so I'm glad for my dad's guidance on that. I know that I don't, at the same time now, I'm not part of anywhere now, but I try my best to make sure that I get along with Canadians. And, I'm thankful for, just yesterday, the Bloc and the Conservative Party for sticking up for First Nations. And so I'm thankful for them. And I realize the power of politics. And when there's the political will to do the right thing, Canada can go anywhere when we stand together. It doesn't always have to be divided.
Right. Well, before we get into politics, since we're Canadians, we have to talk about the weather just a little bit. And I'm looking out the window, and summer is starting to emerge in this country. What are you going to do this summer that's fun? How do you take advantage of the Canadian summer?
Well, I go to powwows. I go to communities, especially when the House is not sitting. Because when the House is sitting, as National Chief, I'm expected to make sure that I'm watching through bills for First Nations. That's what they expect of their National Chief, like Bill 5. And it's been very, very busy. But, taking in powwows this summer, taking in Treaty Day events, celebrating life. First Nations love to celebrate all summer. So I'll be in many First Nations from coast to coast to coast all summer. And there's some places I haven't been yet, like the North. So I will be going to Northwest Territories and to the Yukon, and seeing the diversity of our people, hearing from our people who are so far away from Ottawa, but yet Ottawa has every, under the Indian Act, First Nations, we're the only people legislated around the entire world. Can you imagine that? The 1.5 million of us are the only people. And that's not treaty rights. We signed treaties, and then 11 years later, the Indian Act came into Parliament and came down on us hard in the 1800s. And the damage that that kind of has done, and how this country has evolved the last 150 years. And so I think, you go to some of these far places far in the north or away from Ottawa. Ottawa is a million miles away for some of them. And you want to make sure that their voices are heard, that they're not left out all the time, as they always end up being. But I want to give them a voice to make sure that they're heard and that they're not left out of the Canadian conversations that to be had.
Right. Before we get into the future, I want to talk just a little bit about the past, and I mean the immediate past, because Mark Carney's come in with such a whirlwind of activity. It's easy to forget that Justin Trudeau ever existed. But I'm interested in hearing you reflect on the 9 years of Trudeau's government from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. Because I think that was a pretty significant period of time. And a prime minister that seemed to have an enduring commitment to prioritizing that issue. That isn't necessarily always going to be the case in Canada. So I'm just interested in how you feel about the time Trudeau spent in office and his departure.
I want to thank and uplift Prime Minister Trudeau. He was a good prime minister for First Nations. And I know that, like Paul Martin had lit, and I know that you were there at that time, the Kelowna Accord. We had a big conversation about trying to close some of the disparities in this country. And then after that, we've seen Stephen Harper, and it was like a decade of just no conversation, no meetings between First Nations and the feds, closed doors, no open dialogue. And then Trudeau came in and he kind of kicked those doors down and said, we have to do things differently in this country to make this country a better place.
Right.
And he did move the human index for First Nations up a bit. Did it advance as far as it should have? No, things can always be better. But I think he was a good prime minister for First Nations people. I lift him up. My prayers are with him. I'm happy he gets to see his children now. I thank him for his decade of work and commitment to this country, and more because he was an MP before that for a little bit. And the slander that he would get, like I think his poor kids had to hear that. And whether that's Trudeau's kids, Mark Carney's children, Stephen Harper's children, or Pierre Poilievre's children, I don't want any of their children to hear those things called about any prime minister. It just disheartens, or any minister for that matter. We have to remember we're one country, we're a smaller country. We're all going to know each other through 2 or 3 sets of friends. We're all going to be connected. And so I look to him and I think he did as much as he could. I know it's not always easy. He committed to closing the infrastructure gap on water on First Nations communities. He did a lot of work to bring that number down. We still have a long way to go. I know that Niskandig, I think, for instance, the other day was in my office, and I said, well, what would it, they've had boil water advisory for like close to 12,000 days, 11,000, whatever it was. I had it written down, over 11,000 days for sure. Some of them have never, ever seen clean drinking water in their community. And I said, well, what would it take? And they said, well, a new water plant. Well, why don't we just build that then? And I think that's the conversation that I want to have with, Prime Minister Carney. And I know that I've had those conversations with Mr. Trudeau. I do also want to thank him for his commitment on child welfare, for instance. Look, he put a $47.8 billion offer on the table. I think we can't step back from that now. I think that there's a number and there's a grounding.
Can you leave that for a second? Because I want to get to that.
Yeah.
But I really want to close off on this water thing. How is it possible, like as a layperson that doesn't really understand these issues very well, How is it possible that you could have a prime minister who genuinely cares about it, who's putting lots of money toward it, in office for 9 years, who says, I'm going to eliminate boil water advisories, and he's not able to do it? Like, why is that?
Well, sometimes there's a whole host of issues. I mean, I think also there's, one community, for instance, there's a few communities that I talked to said, we do get, we get water people, water experts into the community, and then the town next door takes them because they could pay more. They could pay more money to their operators. I think that's one small issue on it. But at the same time, the infrastructure, like trying to get some of that infrastructure built in that time, I think people were trying and trying. And I think that there's still work to do that can be done. And let's get back to it and make sure that the full throttle is on it, that it's getting through. There was also a water bill, last parliament that died on the order paper. There could have been many improvements to that bill. And, we were hoping that it would get to Senator Prosper at that time in the Senate to make many of the changes that would have had to been made on that bill to make it a stronger, better bill for everybody. But yeah, like just lots of, I guess, a diversity of issues. And of course, just that commitment to continue to do it. There's always other issues that come up, like forest fires and things that happen in communities, or communities are displaced. There's so many issues, I think, why. And I think, but he did pull it down so much. So like, I commend him for it. I commend him for that work on water. But I think that there's a lot more to do. And we can get there by working together.
They say never bury the lead, so I won't. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is investing $70 billion in Canada over the next 5 years in network infrastructure and operations. That's the largest telecommunications investment program in the country. For proper context, it's no one-time strike while the nation building projects are hot thing either. TELUS has been investing in Canada's potential with all the consistency and industry of our official national critter. $276 billion since the year 2000, damn it. Chew on that for a while, eh? Turns out CN isn't the only sponsor here who can do puns. Anyway, ever spent $70 billion before? Thought not. But join me as I divvy it up here in podcast land. The largest portion is earmarked for cutting-edge infrastructure. TELUS is expanding its lightning-fast and far more environmentally sustainable pure fiber services across BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. They'll connect millions of homes and businesses, including over 200,000 in rural and Indigenous communities. There will also be significant 5G and LTE enhancements at more than 500 sites across Canada. As far as nation-building economic impact goes, it gets to work almost immediately. Communities across the country are immediately more connected, innovative, and competitive, boosting productivity and creating a more robust national economy. Speaking of competitive, let's end this by doing a little who's investing what where contrast with a couple of the other big telco players, shall we? TELUS's $70 billion spent here at home versus the competition's announced cuts to Canadian capital expenditures so that they can invest more on U.S. market expansion. Priorities, I guess. See, never bury the lead, but don't ignore a strong closer either. By the end of his term, his efforts on the First Nations front were seen as a failure, and they were used as evidence of the failure of his prime ministership. You promised that you would get rid of boil water advisories, and it's been a decade, and you haven't done it. So these things actually came around to boomerang on him politically.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I beg to differ. I think that he was trying his best within a system. Ottawa, the bureaucratic system and the way that we run things in Ottawa can be very slow sometimes. Right. And so I don't think it's just him. I think there's also a bureaucracy that is not held to account half the time, or, okay, they do auditor general reports and things, don't change.
You think they didn't agree with him?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I ask somebody else that, but I think that every time that there was a federal budget that he tried to somewhat close the gap, not as fast as we would have liked.
Right.
But I think that he tried his best, and he was a good human. He is a good human. And I wish him well.
I hear you. I had the feeling through the entire time that he was Prime Minister that Indigenous Canadians did not know or appreciate fully what they had in him, in that job. Because it wasn't just him. He was appointing ministers. I don't imagine you could be more committed to the cause than Mark Miller was, for example, or Carolyn Bennett was. Um, so, but um, the the child welfare settlement to me is a good example of that. So again, I'm going to say something that's going to get me in trouble, and you're a bit of a safe space for me, National Chief, but nonetheless, I could get in trouble for this. But that settlement, $47 billion, that is a lot of money. That is an awful lot of money, and you negotiated it, and um, you know the I think Cindy Blackstock is a wonderful person and incredibly smart. And what the work she's done in her life is amazing. And I've had the opportunity to meet her. And Jordan's principle is a phenomenal thing, etc. I'm with it. But the notion that you would turn that down on the eve of a federal election that was at that point quite likely to result in Pierre Poilievre being the prime minister seemed to me to indicate that people didn't understand or care that Trudeau was a uniquely sympathetic prime minister.
I don't even know what to, how would I put this? I'm thankful for the prime minister, the previous prime minister. I'm thankful for his work on child welfare. I'm thankful for that offer. And people probably don't realize how hard that was. Like, I lobbied hard. And I also want to lift up people like Katie Telford in the background, right? And Mark Miller and Mark Miller's chief of staff and just
Mike
many
Burton?
other Mike Burton. Yeah.
He's a great guy, hey?
Yeah. And just so many. David Lametti, who I hear is coming back. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
But all these people that tried really, really hard to get that offer on the table, I am so thankful for them. And I think at the end of your life, you look back. I mean, this is how I was taught from my mom and dad, is like, and my grandparents and my ancestors. When you get to the end of your life and we believe, of course, in Creator and in God. And when you get there and you look back and you say, did I do everything that I could have done? And I think in that instance, you try and do everything that you can do, but you never give up. We have to keep trying to right that wrong. And I lift up Ontario First Nations that are proceeding forward, and I look forward to hoping that wish them well in their endeavor on part of that. So it hasn't been lost. I just think we have to find a different way. It's hard to get a national deal. I don't think AFN's ever done one. But Canada never really does one either. I mean, even on their food program, for instance, something so, that kids need food in schools. Well, they have to go province by province by province. And I think, trying to get a national deal is a real tough thing. But I think we have to keep talking. Look, Ontario came through for their children on taking back some of, taking back child welfare away from the province, because right now 100% of every dollar goes to every province and territory for First Nations children. $0 come to First Nations communities, but yet the numbers of our children in care keep rising and rising and rising because there's no prevention or very limited prevention. And I think that we need to change that. And I'll continue to say that till the day that I go on to the next place, the next realm. And at the end of the day, though, I'm always going to try my best to try and change things, because I think the current child welfare system is so broken.
So, Michael Sabia, Canada's bureaucrat turned captain of industry turned government mandarin turned business titan, is going back into government again, this time as the most senior public servant in Canada, clerk of the Privy Council. Our sponsor, CN, permitted itself a discreet fist pump when that news broke. Sabia's remit, as announced by Prime Minister Carney, is to, quote, advance nation-building projects. And a long time ago, before everybody was talking about big projects, Michael Sabia arrived at CN and showed the business world what building big projects meant. In 1992, he and Paul Tellier, the man who had vacated the job Mark Carney just gave Sabia, arrived at CN with orders to transform an inefficient, heavily subsidized Crown corporation into a money-making, publicly owned modern railway. Stock analysts ridiculed the very idea. Sabia and Tellier pushed sand day and night, and 3 years later, CN became the most successful initial public offering in Canadian history. This is the man the Prime Minister will lean on to get big things done in the crucial months to come. Development of the Ring of Fire, extraction and processing of critical minerals and rare earths, posing the first real competition with China. Ending Canada's internal trade barriers, something that should have been done ages ago. The list goes on. Look, it's easy to repeat boilerplate about how government should just get out of the way of business. But the reality is that government is the single biggest player in the economy, and there are certain things that only government can achieve. Other things require private-public cooperation. And everything, right now, requires speed and pragmatism. As the politicians debate Bill C-5, the One Canadian Economy Act, may they remember that. Our PM and our new clerk of the Privy Council understand all that. Godspeed and good luck. CN stands ready to help, to cooperate, and to lend a hand where needed. Given the threats our economy faces, there can be no excuses. Our supply chains must stay open, smooth, and flowing. You know, I do a little bit of work in the food security area, and the statistics about food insecurity among Indigenous people is shocking. In fact, and you know, that's really strongly correlated. You talk about a food program. I mean, that's really strongly correlated to health and to achievement and to school and everything.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. And I think that AFN's done so many studies. I mean, check our website out and read many of our studies and many of our suggestions on making that better and more whole, right? And it's flabbergasting. And you go to some of these northern communities and you think, wow, like how they survive on $30 block of cheese. And it's maddening when we're in such a rich country. And yeah, so lots more to say on that for sure.
Hey, I was in London at Canada House when a few weeks ago. I was lucky enough to be there when King Charles was being briefed prior to his trip to Canada. And Perry Bellegarde was there.
Yeah.
And who has also been on the show. And Perry Bellegarde was sort of walking the king through. They had a huge map on the floor, and he was walking the king through places in Canada he'd been before, etc. And I know that there's a very special relationship historically between First Nations and the Crown. And does that endure, and why?
Well, my grandfather, Chief Richard Woodhouse, on August 21st of 1871, had signed treaty with Queen Victoria. And so we have the original treaty medal. And when the king came and I was able to greet him wearing that medal, I'm like, here's your grandma. Like it was a real special moment. And then him and I met and we are talking about our family histories and the creation of this country, about my grandfather, signing treaty, and his grandmother, of course. And we want to make the best country possible. And, being foundational partners to this place, it was a moment. I was so glad to welcome him here to this country, to this place. And I'm going back to see him in July. Nobody knows that yet, but I guess now your viewers know it yet. And he started sending me invites and stuff. So I guess maybe we hit it off and we're going to build a stronger relationship.
Oh, fantastic. What do you think you will talk about when you next meet?
I don't know. It's going to be about world issues, and, there'll be global people there, people from around the globe, and apparently a smaller group, but a global discussion. I think I'll know more next week.
Fantastic. That's very cool. Very exciting. Yeah. And London is kind of fun too, by the way.
Yeah. I'm going to some place outside of London. Highgrove, their summer home.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. That's pretty prestigious. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Just a little, that's what I'm doing for the summer. There's my fun summer. Yeah.
Right.
So I'll take my boy with me because my dad got passed down the medal uh, throughout my dad's a chief and then he comes from a line of chiefs and I was never going to marry a chief. So, but here I am.
You are the chief.
I am the chief. And I told
You,
myself I'd never marry a chief because I was born a chief's daughter and I have a whole bunch of brothers. I don't have any sisters. And I just said, I'll never marry a chief because I seen the work life that they had and the thankless days and the effort that they put in. And let me tell you, I feel for our chiefs from coast to coast to coast on the effort. I just commend all of them and I lift them up and I feel them when they have the most stressful jobs in the country.
okay. So let's get to the heart of the political matter that you are dealing with right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the Carney government's legislation to streamline approvals for designated large national projects.
Yep.
And this is born of a moment that galvanized the country in reaction to the American threat to our economy and to our very existence, and upended our politics, led to a different government being selected than anybody would have assumed at one point. And so now we're acting on this and we're going to get stuff built. And that's what the election campaign was about. Build, baby, build. We're going to create our own economy so that we're not subject to the whims of the United States. And the AFN has a problem with that. Why?
Look, I think, First Nations want to be prosperous as well. They're not opposed to prosperity. They are opposed, however, when their rights are potentially being trampled on. And I think it's more of the process. We continue to be disappointed that, of course, First Nations rights holders have been shut out of Bill C's legislative process. And we had saw that at the committees this week, many chiefs were turned away and uninvited. We sent lists in of people that could speak. It's 2025. And I don't think that's acceptable to keep First Nations rights holders out of these discussions. I don't think that's acceptable to keep Canadians out of those discussions. Those lists were cut and many people wanting to speak on such matters. And that shouldn't be the Canadian way. And, ramming through bills, I just think, not a good way to start off a government. And I get it. They want to get some stuff done by July 1st, but cut the bill. It's an omnibus bill.
But the part of it that you're challenging is the part of it they need to pass, to be honest, right? Because they need to get these projects going.
And I don't know if there's a difference between now and September. I mean, I think we save ourselves a whole, slew of issues if we take the summer, have the Prime Minister and Cabinet meet with First Nations head on, and meet with us once and for all, and let's get through it. And we could do that very quickly in a few weeks. And then their fall assembly, they can go ahead and discuss and hear from Canadians on what amendments would make this bill stronger or why it shouldn't proceed and all that. So I mean, we get colonialism as our borders, but we don't need more of Trump's colonialism here in Canada when we're left out of. And look, you talk about Perry Bellegarde. I worked for him and I worked for other national chiefs, Sean Athleo and Phil Fontaine. Many of them were never invited to the table when the provinces and the federal government meet. There's never a space for the founding First Nations partners at the table. We're always left out. And I think that that's a problem. I think that's number one. I think we could be fixing that very quickly if there's the political will. And there isn't, right? There just seems like it's always, we'll meet you the day before like little kids and talk to you like an hour before, and it just happens all the time. I mean, healthcare, for instance, they go and they talk about 60 billion in healthcare and they have us in for an hour the day before to talk about, here, let's talk about a little bit of healthcare with you, but then we'll kick you out of the room. But even though your people are in every province, territory, and section of Canada, we're not even there to speak about those disparities. And this is how Jordan's principle is born, because the provinces and the feds can't even talk about it without fighting, and First Nations aren't even at the table to talk about it fully. So lots of ways that we can be a better country.
It's been tough in Canada with so much economic uncertainty. Broad statement, I know. To give this more context, our sponsor, Fidelity Investments Canada, has some fresh numbers on how Canadians are feeling. According to Fidelity's most recent investor perception study, 60% of Canadians believe that they can't be happy unless they feel financially secure. The data shows paying down debts and volatile markets continue to be the main factors affecting Canadians' perceptions of whether they can meet their financial goals. But it's not all gloom and doom. There are some pockets of resilience. The study also found that a majority of investors have confidence their investments will grow in the future and have peace of mind their investments are secure. That is precisely the mission of Fidelity, to give you peace of mind for your financial future by seeking to deliver consistent, long-term investment performance you can count on. Because performance matters for Fidelity. To find out more about how Canadians are feeling as pre-retirees and retirees, tune in next week for insights from the special 20th edition of Fidelity's annual retirement report. In the meantime, you can follow at Fidelity Canada on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube for more insights. Well, what's wrong with the Carney Bill, Bill 5? Is it Bill 5? What's wrong with the Carney Bill? And don't tell me consultation. Because in my lifelong experience of running consultations, people don't actually care about consultation. They care about the outcome that they want. And so if there's been a consultative process that results in an outcome you don't like, you don't think you've been consulted. So I don't think that what Indigenous people really want is to be consulted and then a decision made that they don't agree with. I think they want changes to this bill. And what are those changes?
I'm going to be honest with you then, David. So because we met by Zoom with chiefs on Monday. We got the bill on Friday, right? Just like everybody else. Monday, we have a, chiefs meeting on Zoom. And we heard some of the, but a lot of chiefs there too has said, like, we need time to review this with our lawyers. How does this affect our rights? We need time to speak to our communities. And a lot of communities weren't even present because they're busy fighting fires, sorry.
Yeah. Actual fires.
Yeah. There's 34 First Nations, a lot of them displaced. One of them has their whole community burnt down. How are they even supposed to look at this? And yet it's going to affect their rights later. And 7 days is just I think for me at this point, it's process, right? I'm about the process and making sure that people are heard. And trying to ram a bill through in 7 days, like I said, not the Canadian way. And why can't we take the summer to talk with each other about this and go through it and have
what would we be talking about though?
About potential amendments, and if people support the bill or not, whether they want it pulled or not, let them make those arguments. Why do we have to shut out diverse views? We don't have to shut out diverse views.
Well, didn't we just have an election about whether or not this all should happen?
Well, I mean, at the same time, when it comes to First Nations rights, why can't we just take the summer? And there is no majority government, right? It wasn't majority. I'm just going to say that, right? So obviously there's difference of opinion.
Right.
And I think difference of opinion is okay. But I think having, we get it. Look, we know that the country, that it's an emergency. We get that. At the same time, we've been waiting a long time for even the basics of infrastructure. How are we going to trust that, this process now? I mean, if we want to talk about speeding something up, let's speed up modern schools for kids on First Nations communities. Let's speed up all weather access roads so that school buses aren't breaking down every year. Let's make sure that homes are built properly and up to, build properly. Let's make sure that communities have safety and community safety. And let's make sure, that we close the infrastructure gap once and for all. I'm sure you may have seen that, the First Nations infrastructure gap that exists. We did a Conference Board of Canada study on it. if we,
hundreds
we're
of
kind
billions
of,
of dollars, right?
yeah. But we're at the bottom of a G7 country right now. We could propel ourselves to number one by putting those investments in right away, closing some of those gaps over the next few years, and it'll make sure that there's jobs for everyone in this country. Make sure that there's, that we close that gap and that we make Canada the best that it can be, and everybody will benefit. I think that's one thing that's uniting right across the country. You got chiefs in the room; they'd say that the basics. How are they going to have all these discussions when the some of these communities don't even have the basic infrastructure? And imagine, I remember during pandemic, for instance, I lived on the reserve with my boys, and Canada was like, yeah, all the schools just go virtual. Everybody goes virtual. Go on the internet. Here's some school divisions are giving iPads to their kids and all that, like making sure that all of that happened. We couldn't, even if we gave iPads to kids on the community I was on, they didn't even have high speed internet. And, they had to lock down longer as well and be out of school longer at that point because there's not even a hospital nearby. Right. There's another community where there's 15,000 people in one area, absolutely no hospital. Like what, that wouldn't happen anywhere else in a town or a city. And I just think that we have a long way to go in this country. We've come a long way, and we have our relationship to continue to work on. And trust is always somewhat of an issue as well. Like, how can we trust?
Are you telling me that you would feel more comfortable with this Carney legislation if there was other evidence of priorities on things that you're talking about?
Well, I think if Prime Minister Carney, which he said he would come and meet with the chiefs. So I put that request into his office again 3 times this week and last week and the week before. Come and meet with the leadership, put us in a room. Let's go in there. Let's talk, even if we have to have a First Minister's meeting about First Nations priorities and issues in this country. We're the only, like I said, First Nations people are the only people legislated around the entire world. And it has resulted in us even the basics. If I wanted to build a McDonald's, for instance, in my community, and it's almost like, and I went to the bank and said, I need to do this. They're like, they'll tell you, you got to go ask the Minister of Indian Affairs, go ask them for a ministerial loan guarantee. What other Canadian would put up with that? I know that there's all these things that we have to talk about. They're uncomfortable. They're even uncomfortable for me sitting here talking to you. But they are the discomfort that we have to talk about. Those unhidden old ways have to go.
So, I don't know how to quite phrase this. Paul Martin educated me in the lead up to the Kelowna Accord about how important process was with Indigenous people and how important it was for people to be able to fully air their truths and their beliefs, and to allow time to build a consensus. And that he always felt that the Kelowna Accord was a success more because of the process than the ideas that were in it. Having said that, it's time consuming and it takes a long time. And it kind of feels like Canadians don't feel like we have a long time right now. So when this bill is passed today, as it will be passed today, I presume, there are going to be consultations because the court has said that Indigenous communities have a right to consultations on the projects, correct? You don't have a right to consultation on the bill, but you have a right to consultation on the project. What are those conversations going to be about? Are they, and let me just be blunt, how much of it's about money? How much of it's about ensuring that Indigenous people, unlike in the past, are fairly compensated and get the fair share of the economic benefit of the project? Is it fundamentally that, or is it that plus a lot of other things? Because just to make my question unbelievably long, I once read a book called The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King, and made me think there's more here than just money.
Absolutely, there is more than just money. Look, I think people also think, like, our people want to think about the environment, because there's some communities that have a lot of development that I talked to the other day, and they said, look, yes, we have money, right? They're okay. but I'm just going to give you a variety of,
yeah.
And they said, but people have to remember the environmental impacts and how we can't even fish anymore. And, how we drive on the roads and there's not even bugs on our windshield because of all the pollution, I guess, in the air and in the waters that are all around their community. I mean, they're living in, beautiful communities, but you can't even fish and do their traditional ways of life. It's more than just money. And I think the other thing is there was another community the other day that was wanting to talk about a project, and then it was just terrible. Like something happened underground. I don't know what had happened, but environmental destruction happened under, and the community or the company doesn't know how to fix it. And I think that there's those issues as well, environmental issues. And then of course there is compensation issues because every time companies come in, they want to take and give you a bricklayer job. Like those days have to be done as well. And I remember just a few years ago, I remember a group of leadership were trying to invest in a hydroelectric project, for instance. And the one premier said, and I remember this so clearly, I was so irritated with him. And he said, "Oh, my constituents don't want third party interest." Well, we're not begging you for anything. We're trying to be a part of the project, invest in it properly, and get some of the dividends that roll out from that. But yet you want to come freely through all of our land, bulldoze through our land, and make it happen. And then you see differences. I mean, there was one mining company, and I'm gonna just name him anyways. Jeff Copeness, our old friend.
Yeah.
Well, it was terrible, and he's made this public anyway. So I told him I'm going to talk about it. But I remember seeing, this one mining prospector about 2 months ago, and Jeff's under a state of emergency right now, Chief Jeff Copeness in his community because of they've got a lot of suicides and things going on in their community, lack of housing and many other issues. And so this prospector sends him an email and says,
he's being a real leader there.
Yeah. And he said, so Chief Copeness says, like, sorry, we don't have time to consult with you right now on mining. We're in the midst of a state of emergency in our community. I don't have time to talk to you right now. At full stop, right? Ends there. Well, this mining exploration president says, oh, maybe you're a terrible leader. That's why everything's happening to your people there. And I thought, so I wrote him back. I was so angry, right? And I wrote back to the mining exploration president and I said, he should never talk to chiefs again.
Right.
He should never talk to communities ever again. He doesn't know how to run a company. Just a terrible thing to say when this community is in the midst of crisis. However, the same day I see Wab Kinew, I see 7 other chiefs. I see all these Manitobans and Canadians opening up another company in the north, and I was happy for them. Like look at how the difference is with the relationship, one way versus another. And I think that's that should be what people are focused on fixing and repairing the relationship, because for 150 years it's been a very oppressive, one-sided relationship where one party benefits and the other doesn't. And I think that that's always a scary conversation to have, but we have to have it.
I gotta just say this to you. I mean, you're from outside of Winnipeg, and I'm from Regina. Wapkinew. The existence of Wapkinew when I grew up in Regina was inconceivable. How do you feel at an emotional and intellectual level about Wapkinew being the premier of Manitoba? Seems to me like just such a barrier broken.
I couldn't believe it because I know Rosanna Deerchild at one time had a story on the front of Maclean's magazine that said Manitoba is the worst province ever and it's very racist. And it is, it still very much is. All those things still happen, whether you have a First Nations premier or not. But I think that moment, I was so happy because I thought, like, the First Nations person, and I remember I got elected as national chief. And so my mom and dad were like, you got to come to the First Nation community. And I looked and she says, we're going to honor you and Wob. So Wob decided, yeah, okay, we'll go. And then I went, and sitting there with, like, here I am as national chief. I was more intrigued with him. And I think he was intrigued with me, and we're like, wow, like here we are, and the world is changing in a good way. Because I couldn't have even, I mean, even just when I was going to run for regional chief, I didn't think I could because I'm a girl,
Right.
right? I brought a boy to, there was a group of chiefs that were going to nominate me. And I remember, bringing this boy in, and I said to all these chiefs, like, he'll run because he's a boy. And this one man, very influential, I won't say the name, but he says to me later, he's like, it's not him, it's you. But even to have that, right? Like, even as a First Nations woman, to have that, and then I'm like, okay, like I knew it because I think creator guides your path. But seeing him smash that glass ceiling that day, I was so nervous the night before. I thought, oh my goodness, I wasn't national chief yet. He was running, and I was regional chief. And I remember going to the Hotel Fort Garry, and I thought, I don't know if this will happen. Like, what if it's a big upset tomorrow?
Right.
And because of the racism that happened during that election. And it was disheartening because I wanted to, like, some of, like, the Conservative Party of Manitoba. I would talk to them. I'd go to their house. I thank some of them, like some of them helped me with a couple of road projects and stuff. Like, I was really disheartened about the comments about the women that were dead in the landfill.
They ran against the Indigenous community. They used it.
But it was disheartening. And I think as a First Nations mother and a woman, I'm like, seeing this on billboards, I'm like, this isn't the way. Like, this is too far. There's a line, and that really, really crossed it. And it was disheartening because I thought some of those people were kinder than that. And especially when the premier at that time was the first woman premier of Manitoba, it was like, as a woman, how could you talk about dead women in a landfill when they don't even have a voice for themselves?
Right.
And I hope, I know that the party has now apologized about it, but it was really hurtful. And I don't know, like, I could never, no matter if my worst enemy, I could never talk like that about other women that don't have a voice in a landfill. You'd want to do everything that you can to help their families. And so when he'd won that day, I was like, wow, like, and I couldn't believe it. But I was glad that Manitobans did the right thing. But I almost wondered, because had he not, then knowing that racism and that ideology would have won was very scary at that moment, to be honest.
Yeah, but you're under no illusions that it's not there.
Oh, it's always there. I mean, I think both sides. Sometimes we're, First Nations too could be a little tough on, both ways, right? I mean, Canadians are Canadians. We're as diverse. First Nations are as diverse as Canadians. I mean, we have, like, our members of parliament, for instance. I'm so happy we have 8 for the first time in Canada's history.
Yeah.
And I want to look at people like Paul Martin that started that off in a good way to make us part of the parliamentary system. And we're in every party now. And I'm so happy to see that. And, Wab Kinew, he's in the NDP, and I hope there'll be other premiers down the way. And I'm just so thankful to see that.
Right. So, National Chief, just to close out now, we've talked about the things that were on my mind, but what's on your mind? Like, what is your agenda for your people over the next number of years? And how are you looking for Canadians to get behind you?
Look, I ask for Canadians to help us close the infrastructure gap for First Nations kids. Let's focus on our children. Let's make and give First Nations children the same opportunities that any Canadian child has. And look, Canada has issues everywhere. But I have to say, when I go around the world now, when I travel, and you see parents begging for food on the street for their kids, I'm glad that Canada, not saying that we don't have food insecurity, we do, but you don't see the prevalence of it like our neighbors to the south, for instance, that have no safety net for their children. And you see moms begging for food with their little kids, or in other countries. I'm glad that we have the child tax benefit, for instance. I'm really glad for that in this country. And I know that we have to progress forward.
Another game-changing Trudeau policy, by the way.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But I'm glad for that, right? Like, because it helps to make sure that everyone has somewhat of a safety net. Doesn't make people wealthy and well off. No, but I mean, I think it makes sure that everybody every month has access to groceries, right? And I think that raising kids is really expensive. But if we focus on our kids in this country, we're going to make the best country that we can. And what does that mean? Let's have these hard conversations on truth, on reconciliation, on First Nations issues with Canada and vice versa, and maybe even the provinces. We always end up beating in court all the time because they're the little governments. They were after the treaty, and they were after the creation of the country. We have to have all these hard, truthful questions, and we shouldn't be scared about sitting together at the table, making a full seat for First Nations at the table when provinces and the feds meet and stuff. So look, lots of stuff we can do. Close the infrastructure gap. Also, let's start talking about community safety and policing in this country, and making sure that First Nations have access to more policing and safety. Also, let's fix child welfare. Hard conversation, of course.
You want more police. You're not for defund the police. You want more police.
I'm more, let's fund First Nations policing services, because like you look at some of, the ones that we have now in Canada. First of all, we used to have 56. We're now down to like 37. Why the decline of First Nations led police forces? And those forces don't kill people. They haven't killed any of our people. And why? And yet the main police forces have had a lot of altercations. Why the disparity, right? So lots of things to work through, and let's listen to each other as a country. Let's listen to each other. Let's again sit at the table, and let's make sure as well that the true history of Canada is in every school across this country, so that we're not having these same conversations, you and I, 20, 30 years later, that we actually try to understand each other. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, National Chief, I hope we are still having conversations, maybe not 30 years from now, because I'm 63. And in my experience, 93-year-old people aren't that interesting.
At that point, in 30 years, I want to be relaxing and let my children take over these conversations, and their grandchildren. But let's hope they're more progressive conversations on other issues rather than the basic needs of our First Nations kids at the moment. We need Canadians' help on that.
Right. I hear you. Thank you so much for your time today. And I hope you'll come back and we'll talk.
I will.
Again.
Thank you. Yeah, take care.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and Fidelity Investments Canada, and National Chief Woodhouse for her time. All you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to the show, we'll see you next week. Take care of yourselves.